Welcome to my telephone and video remote interpreting journal. This is the section of my YouTube channel where I discuss the highlights of my workday as a medical interpreter. My name is Nanji Mateo. I'm the founder of interpremet.com and I'm a certified Spanish medical interpreter. Before we begin, don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss any of my new videos. Let's get started. First, let's talk about how useful is screen sharing for certain interpreting sessions. I'm doing a lot of IEPs and annual reviews over Zoom these past few days. IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. During these meetings, parents and teachers talk about the goals, strengths, and areas of improvement for a student receiving special education and how can the school support them to succeed. They oftentimes share and read the teacher reports about that particular student's performance in their courses. Whenever somebody reads of a document, it's very difficult for the interpreter to interpret in the consecutive mode for a couple of reasons. The language used in written documents is sometimes very dense and more challenging to remember. This wouldn't be a huge problem if the teachers would read each goal or a couple of sentences at a time. But they usually tend to read the whole document in front of them without any pauses. So interpreting consecutively becomes extremely difficult. I noticed that the teachers recently started to share screen these teacher reports and IEP modifications on Zoom. So now, instead of interpreting consecutively those lengthy documents, I side translate them. This has made my life so much easier. So, side translation is possible in remote interpretation, at least with Zoom, and I'm glad that teachers know how to use it and take advantage of technology to help LEP parents. This also reminds me of another type of side translation that consecutive medical interpreters engage in. For example, when a doctor sent me the screening questions in the chat section and asked me to side translate them for the patient. This wasn't necessarily ideal for the patient since the doctor isn't directly asking the medical history questions to the patient, but it's something that can happen. It also reminds me of one time that I had to explain the different kinds of insulin pumps to a diabetic patient, or when I was explaining a genetic disorder to a parent using PowerPoint slides shared by the provider, and I interpreted consecutively. So it wasn't a side translation directly, but having the PowerPoint visuals really supported the delivery of the message for both the interpreter and the patient. If we compare educational interpreting with medical interpreting, I feel like teachers have a much wider knowledge of linguistics and how the interpretation works more than doctors. They are very kind and rarely in a rush, unlike some providers in the hospital who seem to be running around like a chicken with its head cut off. In fact, one of the teachers actually advocated for the student when she said that teachers shouldn't rely on Google Translate to translate directions into Spanish for the student, that it was better to have a human translator because Google Translate is not that good for this kind of tasks. I felt very good when she said that because she's aware of our value as interpreters and translators, human translators. My second insight is about simultaneous interpretation. I've been breaking into conference interpretation through different volunteering opportunities for nonprofits, especially when the topic to discuss is related to underserved communities like the LGBTQ, indigenous people, local communities, etc. I'm also training for 2 hours every day in the simultaneous mode. And this is one of the insights that I had in terms of acronyms in English and Spanish. English speakers love acronyms, and they come very naturally to them. But in Spanish, we don't use a lot of acronyms, and it feels rather weird to use them because the everyday Spanish speakers does not use acronyms as much as an English speaker. So, as a rule of thumb, in Spanish, you always expand the full acronym to convey more meaning, and it also feels more natural. However, in the simultaneous mode, you have to stay on top of the speaker space. An acronym that takes 2 seconds to say in English, in Spanish, it may take 5 or 6 seconds each and every time. So, if you don't want to stay behind as an interpreter or lose your focus or omit something, you have to use the acronym in English to preserve the accuracy of the message and ensure smooth delivery, basically, so that you can keep going and don't get stuck, so that your speaking style is pleasant to listen to instead of stumbling upon these acronyms and expansions all the time. So I think that's something that English speakers who work in multicultural settings must be aware of. They need they don't need to use the expansion of the acronym all the time, but repeat the expansion just a couple of times at different times throughout the meeting, so it's easier for attendees to understand what they are really talking about. My third insight is about building rapport in social services. So, I got a call from a social services institution with a 64 years old homeless Spanish speaker who was receiving an interview to retire because he was going to turn 65 very soon. I really liked that the English speaker tried to empathize with him by repeating some Spanish words back to him, but not in a condescending way. Rather, he was showing understanding to him. The LDP seemed to be confused with very simple questions, and he will use words like shelter in English, untranslated, instead of the Spanish translation, which is refugio. And sometimes when I was addressing him, interpreting for him, I will use the terms that he used instead of the most correct quote unquote translation, according to some prescriptivist interpreters. Especially in exam and courses, they tell you that you should avoid using English words or Spanglish, for example, in our rendition into your other language, that everything should be said in one language only. But in this particular circumstance, it was more appropriate to use the terms that the LEP was using because those are the terms that he's most familiar with. So it just made more sense to use the word shelter in English than the translation. So it's not a hard and fast rule that says we should use X translation or this group of words only for the translation of X term. I think interpreting is much more complex than that. Of course, if you take the liberties to change the register and the words of the message all the time because you think the LEP is not smart enough to understand them, then we have a problem. We actually have to use our critical thinking and soft skills to choose the most appropriate word or translation given the situation and the circumstance. At the end of the day, we are here to help people communicate and not to teach them how to speak properly. So, this approach is a more descriptivist approach, which is something that I've been learning in my linguistic classes. Being a descriptivist means that you don't try to impose your own language use over others because you think it's more correct or valuable, and that this is the way that everyone should speak. People who do this are actually called prescriptivists because they prescribe how language should be used. There is a very interesting quote that summarizes the point that I'm trying to make here, and it's from Fassel and Connor Linton, and it's linguists approach language in the same way astronomers approach the study of the universe, or that anthropologists approach the study of human cultural systems. It will be ridiculous for an astronomer to speak about planets orbiting stars incorrectly and inappropriate for an anthropologist to declare a culture degenerate simply because it differs from their own. So I think this is a very good mindset for interpreters and translators to have. So let me know in the comment section if you have any comments about the insights I shared. The first one was about screen sharing in Zoom for educational appointments. The second one was about the use of acronyms in simultaneous interpretation. And the third one was about descriptivism and prescriptivism for certain English to Spanish words. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to receive a notification when I upload my next OPI VRI journal episode. I'm reading your comments, and until the next time, thank you.